into the negative effects of comic books as part of a larger investigation into causes of juvenile delinquency, which was a kind of sort of hallucinatory fear at that moment in the 1950s, the era of Marlon Brando in The Wild One and James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause. There was this great fear of juvenile delinquents, that all the children were going to become criminals, which has a number of complex social factors that led to this anxiety having to do with affluence after World War II and the emergence of teenagers as a cultural category and so forth. But that's a whole other conversation. Regardless, there was this investigation into causes of juvenile delinquency. For 2 days, they investigated comics. Again, this was organized by the Senate of the United States. It was broadcast on television. They showed pictures of, these horrible comic books. This is Frederick Wortham himself testifying. Some people defended comics as well. But overall, this created a real anxiety among the comics publishers who feared that they were about to be put out of business. Anyway, but you can see that in terms of the status of the comic book at that moment in time, in the 1950s, certainly they meet the formal conditions of comics, they meet the cultural conditions of comics. In some cases, they met the formal conditions of art. They certainly did not meet the cultural conditions of art. Unfortunately, they came to be seen as unacceptable parts of mass culture. This is what almost happened to the comic strips, but then they became acceptable. The comic books, on the other hand, they were unregulated, and they went too far, and they became unacceptable parts of mass culture.
Donc vous avez compris, ça continue, il y a un procès, ça correspond vraiment aux années 50 où effectivement se développe aux États-Unis la prise de conscience qu'il y a une difficulté avec les adolescents, et même que la catégorie d'adolescents maintenant doit être prise en charge, des jeunes adultes. Donc il y a des films, vous le savez, très célèbres, qui montrent des adolescents en révolte. Et donc du coup, ça pose un problème sur le statut de ces comics. On accepte finalement toujours les comic strips qui continuent à être publiés dans les journaux, mais les comic books, eux, deviennent des objets dangereux qui sont considérés donc comme inacceptables.
And usually when things become unacceptable, they run the risk of censorship. And in this case, what happened was the comics publishers became so afraid of being put out of business that they decided to censor themselves. So the comic book industry adopted its own very harsh, draconian code of content called the Comics Code. And among other regulations of the Comics Code, the code mandated that the good must always triumph over evil. Authority figures could never be presented in a negative light. There could never be any reference to divorce or anything that made the family, that was critical of the family unit. There could be no references to sexuality or drug use. No extreme violence, no cannibals, vampires, and zombies, no depictions of the methods of a crime that someone might be able to duplicate, and so on. Essentially, the Comics Code created a situation where, in order to be publishable and acceptable to distributors, a comic book needed to be appropriate for a small child.
Donc on voit apparaître un code de bonne conduite, finalement un code qui donne les conditions de publication des comics, et ça produit effectivement une censure. Alors, ce qui est interdit, par exemple, c'est de montrer le triomphe du mal sur le bien. Il faut toujours que le bien finisse par triompher. Il faut que les figures d'autorité soient toujours en contrôle, finalement, et dominantes, maîtrisent la situation jusqu'à la fin. Il faut éviter de parler de divorce. Surtout, il y a des sujets impossibles comme le sexe, la drogue, l'extrême violence. Jamais montrer aussi une méthode criminelle, de peur qu'elle soit bien sûr imitée par le lecteur. Et puis, interdiction de ces figures comme les zombies, ou quand on pense à ce qui se fait aujourd'hui, on voit que c'est exactement
and it was effective in a number of ways. I mean, it put many of the publishers out of business. Here we see before and after. I don't know that I can say anything more articulate than this image. But it put a number of publishers out of business anyway, and it also eliminated many genres. The horror comics disappeared, the crime comics disappeared, and it really eliminated the possibility that had previously been incipient that comics might start to reach out towards an older audience. It really stopped that process of attempting to tell more sophisticated kinds of stories or branching out into other kinds of genres that might be of greater interest to an older reader. One of the effects of the Comics Code, and this is important in American culture, is that it created the condition for the return of the superhero, which was a fad that had died at the end of World War II. But if good must always triumph over evil and the violence can't be too extreme and so on and so forth, well, the superhero comics are very good at this. And many characters who are popular today, like Spider-Man and the X-Men, Iron Man, the Avengers, the Hulk, you may have heard of some of these. They emerged in the early 1960s as a response to the Comics Code, and many of the older superhero characters who had been popular before World War II returned. You know, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, etc.